Back.
Baruch Hashem. Hi, Sammy.
Hi,
Hi,
Sami. It's
everyone.
here.
Hi,
Hi,
All right.
Sami.
Sammy.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Shalom
Hi,
Aleichem.
Shalom. Shalom, Sami.
Hi, all girls. Okay,
Hello.
let's start.
Mm,
Today we're continuing the main theme over the past through a few classes, and today also a little bit is the authenticity and the reliability of the oral tradition. And the Kuzzari, he has a few challenges, a few fair questions and challenges, which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in the voice of the Haver, comes to respond to. The main idea overall, if in the previous sections we were talking about the supremacy of revelation over a speculative religion. What does God want from us, from humanity? And we had a revelation, and we received a Torah. He says, even when it comes to understanding and applying the Torah in real life, right? You could still have the tension between how do you interpret it, speculative interpretation, or a transmitted tradition of that revelation from Sinai, one generation after the other. And even in places where the Torah purposely left things ambiguous, there was still a centralized institution to interpret the Torah for us, a recognized institution of Hachamim that we appointed over ourselves, represent us, and they can define the ambiguous laws. And they can also redefine ambiguous laws if a later generation of Hachamim of the Supreme Court wants to redefine an ambiguous law, uh, not a law that we received its interpretation from Moshe through tradition, but something that was purposely left open. The Hachamim can interpret it. And now the Kuzzari, right? We started at the end of last class talking about Kedusha, the notion of sanctity, and the notion of purity and impurity. And the Kuzzari says, even so, the rabbis, okay, they were very meticulous in copying down the written law. They were very meticulous in recording oral tradition. However, we see there's this whole body of laws that have to do with Tum'ah and Tahara, which the Karaites seem to be take very, very seriously. And we'll call it the mainstream Judaism or the Rabbinic Judaism doesn't really pay attention to. And so the rabbi starts to respond. We started this already last week. We'll start again from here. It says purity and sanctity, right? Tumayin tahara on one hand, and kedusha, right? Sanctity on the other. They're two interconnected things, right? They're parallel concepts. One cannot be understood without the other. Without holiness, the concept of impurity would have no meaning. The whole notion of pure and impure is like saying it's fine to go or to bring it to the mikdash, or it's not. It has no entrance to the mikdash. That's all what purity and impurity is about. There is no isur to be impure. It's not forbidden. If you're impure, you're not doing an avirah. There's nothing wrong with you. All it means is that you can't go to the mikdash until you purify yourself. Impurity means that a person is temporarily barred from approaching things that God has made holy, such as priests, their sacred foods and garments, right? So a priest, a kohen, he can't eat tirumah, the donations of the people where they donate, whether it's animals or the korban or food, or when we do halal, when we make bread, we do Nehafrish challah tirumah. We make a donation of the challah for the kohen. However, today, I'm sure you've all done challah, right? Today, what do we do with the challah that we separate from the rest of the batch? So we burn it. Why do we burn it? Because a kohen could only eat it when he's pure, and there are no pure kohanim today. Right? So that's all it means. So the priests, their sacred foods and garments, the offerings, the sacrifices, and the temple itself. Right? What does Kiddusha mean? It means something that belongs to the Kodesh. What is the Kodesh? The Kodesh is a section of the Mikdash. Mikdash means the holy place. Right? It's all there on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It means up to where can you enter in the Temple Mount if you are Tameh. Certain places will be restricted to you. Likewise, holiness imposes restrictions on person connected to it, limiting his contact with certain ordinary things. All of this is fundamentally connected to the presence of the Shekhinah, which we no longer possess in its full form today. Why don't we have the full form of the Shekhinah today? Because in order to have the full form of the Shekhinah, we need to have the full Mikdash. Once we reinstitute the temple services and rebuild the temple, we will restore the full Shekhinah to the nation. The prohibition against relations with a woman during menstruation and after childbirth remains in force, but is not primarily a law of ritual impurity, right? So a person, a woman, when she has her menstruation period, she has a period of tum'ah, which she has to go afterwards to the mikveh, right? But, right, the forbidden in having relations has nothing to do really with any kind of, there's no real physical manifestation of purity and impurity. It's what we call gzerat hakatuv. It's a restriction of the law. It's a legal restriction for a man and a woman to have relations at this time. It is an independent divine commandment. We call gzerat hakatuv. It's just asur. There's nothing wrong with being impure. It's just you need to go to the mikveh at the end of that time. The additional practices of maintaining distance and safeguards intended to prevent transgressions. There's two misvot regarding the nidah. One is not to have relations, and the other is also not to what they call chibah, any kind of loving closeness between a man and his wife. Why? It has nothing really to do with purity and impurity. It's just to safeguard the couple from having relations. The classical laws of ritual impurity have largely ceased to function in practice because we live constantly surrounded by sources of impurity. In cemeteries, among graves, corpses, disease, and other conditions that make ritual purity impossible to maintain. The laws of Tum'ah and Tahara are very nuanced, they're very difficult. It's very easy to become Tameh. And the biggest impurity is Tum'at Met, the impurity of the dead. And the only way you can purify yourself from that is with the ashes of a red heifer, a para aduma, which we don't have today, so nobody could really purify themselves. If you've ever been to a cemetery or you've ever been in contact with somebody who's been to a cemetery, then you have tumat metim. And so to purify yourself, so everyone is impure, and nobody has access to the Efer Paraduma to purify ourselves. So then what's all this observance that the Karaites have with the laws of purity and impurity? There's no Mikdash, there's no Korbanot, right? Nobody has access to the Paraduma. They don't have it either. Touching a carcass is not prohibited because it causes impurity. Rather, the impurity is secondary to the separate prohibition against eating it, right? What we call behemat teme'ah, right? The impure animals, right? Impure animals just means that we're not allowed to eat them. Israel had not instituted immersion for certain conditions. Bathing would simply be a matter. Had Israel not instituted immersion of certain conditions, bathing would simply be a matter of cleanliness rather than law. Ezra and his court, they tried to institute a law that a man, after having relations, needs to go and immerse himself in the mikveh before praying. That that legislation didn't hold. It was a gezerah. It was a rabbinic decree that didn't hold, and it was canceled. Right? There is no harm in viewing such practices as promoting cleanliness, right? Provided one does not transform them into new religious obligations. You want to accept upon yourself like a midat hasidut to go to the mikveh. There's many men, they go to the mikveh every morning before tefillah. Why? If they want to do it for some sort of cleanliness, and maybe it clears their mind before the tefillah, that's fine. But he says you should not transform it into a religious obligation. Only what the Hachamim instituted is a religious obligation, and even this, which Ezra and Anshe Knesset Agdolah instituted, but it didn't catch on, and it was later annulled, right? Don't view going to the mikveh every day as some sort of religious obligation. Once people begin improving the law according to their own reasoning, they inevitably create divisions. Differing opinions multiply, and this fragmentation becomes the beginning of religious corruption. Soon there is no longer one Torah and one law. It says the main mitzvah, why we have one central Sanhedrin, is why we are one nation. We're meant to be following one law. Everyone should be following the same law. There should be no division between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Timanim and whatnot. We should all be following the same law. There could be, some flavored customs among the different communities, but there should be ultimately one law. And once everyone or every different group of people starts accepting some sort of minhag as a religious obligation, and each one has its own stringency in different things, then this one nation with one law it gets corrupted and it starts to dissolve. And that is an isur deoraita. That is a biblical prohibition to have the Torah branch out into many different Torah. So every law has precise boundaries established with exactness. Remember we said, who is the pious? It's not someone who accepts stringencies upon himself. We call it medakdek b'misvot. He is precise in following the law. So the Talmud is full of discussions of, we'll call it end case scenarios, right? So there's a law, a general law, and they keep trying to see what is the exact boundary of this law. Even when those boundaries may not seem obvious. A pious person may choose to be stricter, but he may not redefine what the law itself permits or forbids. Right? Maybe you want to, let's say there's a rabbi. So it comes to the question to the rabbi, and he says, how many cups of wine do I need to drink on Leila Seder, Erev Pesach? The halacha says 4 cups of wine, each one a revi'i, right? The rabbi, there's a minhag to have a 5th cup of wine for the, how do you call it, for the geula. All right, so he's machmir with himself. Says, on Leila Seder, I have a 5th cup. Right? Maybe, if I drink too much, I lose count of cups. I'm going to have a 6th cup just to make sure I'm covered. All right? But if someone comes to ask the rabbi how many cups of wine, he shouldn't say, well, it's good to have a 5th cup for the geula and maybe a 6th cup just to make sure that you're doing the mitzvah, but not 7 because it's a suit to get drunk. But he says 4 cups. That's the answer. 4 cups of wine. That's it. So a person may choose to be stricter on certain things for himself, but this isn't an instruction for the people. You can't turn this into some sort of religious prohibition. Thus, the meat of an animal close to death may still be permitted because recovery remains possible. Conversely, an animal that appears healthy may be forbidden if it suffers from an internal condition from which it cannot recover. What is a terefa? Right, every year the term terefa. So you have kosher and non-kosher animals, right? So a cow is a kosher animal, yet it could be, this specific cow could be non-kosher. What would make it non-kosher be called a terefa is if it has some sort of injury or disease which would cause it to die from its disease within a year. Then it's called a terefa. It's as if it was attacked by another animal, and this is a dead corpse, even though it's actually alive. So Masechet Chulin, it's a big Masechet, deals with all the nuances of when an animal is considered terefa and when it's not considered terefa. Right? So a person can accept upon himself that I am not going to eat any animal that ever even had a suspicion that it might be terefa. If an animal has a suspicion, then what you do is, well, when you slaughter it, you need to check to make sure if he indeed had that internal problem, like if he's missing his liver, or he's missing half his liver, you say it's not a terefa. If he's missing his entire liver, then it is a terefa. So if you have a suspicion, then when you slaughter the animal, before you eat it, you need to check. If you have no suspicion, you don't even need to check. Someone relying solely on personal reasoning may easily reach the opposite conclusion. Again, we're going back to authentic tradition versus speculation. So the Talmud has these discussions at length to discuss the precise boundaries of every single law. Therefore, do not make your own taste or intuition the measures of religious truth. Personal opinions differ from one person to another and easily lead to confusion and heresy, which is exactly what we saw with the Karaim. Anybody could take a pasuk and interpret it in any way, and without a precise tradition and precise legal boundaries, it's easy to go astray. Instead, examine the foundations of both the written and oral law. Study the Torah, study the Halakha, and be confident in the tradition that we received to rely on it and trace the practical rulings back to their roots. Where the tradition leads, place your trust, even if your instincts initially resist. Maybe you don't understand the reasoning of the Chachamim. That's fine. You're not expected to understand the reasoning of the Chachamim or the reasoning of God. But we have a tradition, and for whatever reason, these are the specific boundaries of the law. As long as you're within those boundaries, whether you understand it or not, right, you can trust that you are performing the mitzvah properly. Many truths established by reason seem to contradict appearances. So now he's giving examples from science. Many scientific truths run contrary to what first appears obvious. So too with halakha. Whenever the sages declared permitted or forbidden was not based on personal preference, but on inherited knowledge transmitted to them. Anyone who judges the ruling solely according to his own understanding will misunderstand them. For instance, he brings here, I guess in the area I may have cut it out because it was going too long. He brings a lot of examples. An interesting example that he brings is believing that the earth is round like a ball is counterintuitive, right? When we, from our personal experience walking around the world, we see the world seems flat. But science has proven to us already back in his days, 900 years ago, right? This is before the church forced everyone to believe the world is flat. It says 900 years ago, science has already proven to us and even calculated the radius of the earth so that we know that it's round. It says it's counterintuitive that the sun is hundreds of times bigger than the earth. But our geometry and astronomy is able to prove it, right? So there's many things, even in science, that once you study it, you reach conclusions that go against your initial thinking and intuition. So it's same thing goes with halakha and law, or Jewish law. Whatever the sages declared permitted or forbidden was not based on personal preference, but on inherited knowledge transmitted to them, what we call Kabbalah, a transmitted tradition. Anyone who judges their rulings solely according to his own understanding will misunderstand them, just as an untrained person misunderstands the language of philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers. Right? It's very easy to read a book on philosophy, which could be very difficult and deep, right? If you're not trained in philosophical thinking, if you're not trained in the language and terminology of the Chachamim or of the philosophers, it's very easy to misunderstand them. By the way, I think this is something that plagues uh, many people who refer to themselves as experts in Maimonides and experts in the Kuzzari. They misunderstand a lot of what they say, in my opinion. Yet both elements are necessary. If one follows legal reasoning alone, religion gradually becomes too permissive. If one abandons legal structures and relies only on religious enthusiasm, division and sectarianism inevitably follow. There's a tension here between being strict legal definitions and we'll call it your own emotional, spiritual, religious enthusiasm. So you use the traditions or the legal definitions to define the boundaries of what is mutar and asur, right? But within those boundaries, you're free to express your religious feelings, right? Freely. You have to have that balance between the two. The law, therefore, requires both a stable legal framework and genuine religious devotion. Right? So, for instance, the Torah says regarding tzedakah, it says, "Hamarbe lo yosif al homesh hamamit lo yiten pachot." You have the minimum tzedakah you can give is 10%. Says a person who wants to give a lot of tzedakah says you shouldn't be giving more than 20%, right? Between 10 and 20%, that's the right amount. Less than 10% is a bit stingy. More than 20% is excessive. So we have precise legal boundaries, right? But within that, says you can go with your feeling. Without the first, religion loses its boundaries, right? If we have no clear definitions, then anybody will just do what they want. And without the second, it loses its soul, right? People's personal feeling of connection and devotion. So the Kuzzari, he says, in that case, I readily admit that the Rabbinites, right, the Rabbinic sect, who combine both legal precision and genuine religious devotion, is superior to the Karaite in both theory and practice. Such a person can serve God with confidence and joy, knowing that his practice rests upon a trustworthy tradition handed down by authorities who ultimately received it right from God, from Moshe. It says Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, received the Torah from Sinai. Saran, he transmitted to Yoshua, to the Zikanim, to the Nevi'im, to the men of the Great Assembly, and Sheikh Knesset HaGedolah, and from them to the Tanaim, from the Tanaim, right, who wrote the Mishnah, to the Amoraim, who wrote the Talmud, to the Geonim, and the Geonim ended maybe 3 generations before the Yehuda Halevi, from the Geonim to the rabbinic authorities in Spain, and so on, from generation to generation until today. Now I would like to ask about the Eruv. Which appears to be a legal leniency regarding the Shabbat. How can something that God forbid be made permissible through what seems to be such an artificial device? What do you think? Any suggestions? There is one of the 39 of the Avot Melachot, one of the 39 forms of work that are forbidden on Shabbat, is carrying it's called from one issue to another, from private property to the public domain. or within the public domain. If you're standing in the public domain, you're 4 amot, right? 2 meters by 2 meters around you is your private domain. You're not allowed to transfer something from your private domain, meaning when you're in the public domain, more than 2 meters. Yet, many people we see walking around on Shabbat carrying keys, carrying their talit, right? That's why I always make sure I wear my talit. There's a garment, I never carry it, right? People carry food from one place to another. And you ask them why, they say because there's an Eruv. So how does an Eruv, something that was instituted by the rabbis, how can it come to permit something that the Torah forbade? And here there's a very, very big misconception regarding what the Eruv actually is, which we'll need to address. So it says, God forbid that the pious sages of Israel would ever agree to weaken or undo any part of the divine law. The Chachamim don't legislate leniencies, things that the Torah forbade, they don't permit, ever. What they do is the opposite. They sometimes forbid things that the Torah permits in order to make a safeguard for the Torah so that people don't come to transgress a biblical mitzvah. Their goal was the exact opposite, to strengthen it. It says, Ve'asu siyag la Torah. That's the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Is one of the instructions to the Hachamim, Ve'asu siyag la Torah, to make a fence around the Torah so that people don't transgress the Torah. For instance, the first Mishnah in Masechet Berachot, right? When do we say Shema in the evenings? The Hachamim say you can say the Shema until midnight, Ad Hasot. What is the halacha? The halacha is really, you could say it until sunrise. But the Chachamim said anything that you can do until sunrise, he said we have to do it until midnight. Why? Because they're afraid that someone's going to wait until midnight, fall asleep, and he won't wake up until the morning, and he didn't say Shema. So say make sure to say the Shema before midnight. So they come to strengthen the Torah. This is why they taught, make a fence around the Torah. Asu siyag la Torah. Part of that fence was the rabbinic prohibition against carrying from a private domain to a public domain and vice versa, restriction that goes beyond the original biblical prohibition. So I'll explain this because really there is a biblical prohibition of carrying from the public domain to the private domain and the other way around. However, what the Torah defines as the public domain is not what the Chachamim define as the public domain. So there's an area, there's like a gray area in between, which according to the Torah, you should be allowed to carry freely in that domain. And the Chachamim, they made a restriction, and they said that this area, what they call the Carmelit, this area, we're going to make it as if it's the public domain. And so the Chachamim said, even though, according to the Torah, in the Carmelit, you're allowed to carry, we're going to forbid carrying in that area. And for instance, something that could be considered a reshut hayachid, a private domain, according to the biblical definition, is a walled city. A walled city that's completely enclosed. Even if it has 10,000 people residing in that city, if it's completely sealed, it's considered, according to the Torah, a private domain, and you're allowed to carry freely within that city. The Chachamim came and they said any private domain that can be divided into separate living quarters, what they call Halukah Diyurim, any place that could be separated into separate living quarters where everyone is holek reshut le'asmo, where they can assign themselves their own domain, says we're going to treat it as if it's a public domain. According to this logic, in my opinion, really, also an apartment building should be considered a reshut rabim. However, I'm not going to go as far as to say don't do tiltul within how do you call it, an apartment building where nobody else has forbid that. But in my opinion, really also an apartment building should also be considered, would need an Eruv. So what do the Chachamim do? The Chachamim say certain areas where the Torah actually permits carrying, we want to forbid it. Why? Because we're afraid that if someone is carrying in this gray area domain, then they'll make a mistake and also carry in the public domain. Or if they're going to carry from their personal domain into the Karmelit, they may also carry from the personal domain into the Reshut Harabim, the public domain, or from the Karmelit into the public domain, and then they're transgressing a biblical mitzvah. So we want to prevent that. And so what do? Okay, but we don't want to make the people's lives too difficult. So they also prescribed that if you make an Eruv in this place where the Bible actually allows you to carry, then the whole point of the Eruv is that you have some sort of sign to remind you that really you shouldn't be carrying. But the Chachamim say you can carry in this case if you make the Eruv. Is that understood? What the point of the Eruv is? For instance, another Eruv that we have is you're not allowed to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, right? But the Chachamim, they restricted cooking from Yom Tov to another day. Why? Because they don't want people working hard on Yom Tov. It says, really, according to the Torah, you can cook for an entire army on Yom Tov if you want to. But the Chachamim don't want you working hard on Yom Tov, so they restrict cooking from Yom Tov to another day. What happens, though, if you have Shabbat right after Yom Tov? Like we had now on Shavuot, recently Shavuot, and then Shabbat. If you can't cook on Shavuot, you won't have food to eat on Shabbat. So what do? So the Chachamim who restricted cooking from Yom Tov to another day, they said if you make an Eruv, right, which is a rabbinic enactment, if you make an Eruv, that'll allow you to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat. But never does their Eruv come to permit something that is biblically forbidden. It comes to do the exact opposite. You say, Hapeh she'asar hu hapeh she'hetir. Right? The mouth that forbade something is the one that can permit it. So if God forbids something, only God could permit it. If the Chachamim forbid something, the Chachamim can also provide a means to permit it. And that's what the Eruv is. It's the Chachamim permitting you to carry in a place where the Chachamim forbade you from carrying, but not allowing you to carry in a place where the Torah forbids you to carry. That the Chachamim can do. Is that understood? So that's the main idea of the Eruv. The problem is today most people treat the Eruv as a leniency, and they go like if there's a string around your neighborhood, they consider that an Eruv. Right? That's not an Eruv. An Eruv needs to be an actual like wall or fence or something, and that's just one component of the Eruv. There are other components of the Eruv, like there needs to be a common meal. Right? So what Eruv originally is let's say you have it's called a hatzer, a courtyard with 3 or 4 houses attached to it. And they have like a common courtyard in the middle. So the Hakamim said, really, according to the Torah, that courtyard, the Hatzer, is a place that should be considered a private domain. However, the Hakamim instituted that any private domain that has separate living quarters in it will be treated as a public domain and therefore forbid carrying in there. So those 4 neighbors sharing that same yard, really, according to Torah, should be able to carry from one house to another. But the Chachamim forbid it. But they said, if you make an Eruv, what is an Eruv? If you put aside a meal, right? 2 things, same way that we do, exactly the same thing that we do with the Eruv Tavshinin, right? You take a piece of bread and a piece of meat, right? You put it in one person's house, right? In one place within those 4 houses and the courtyard, and everyone participates in that meal, then what you're doing is you're sharing your domain with your neighbors. That's how the Eruv works. Every member of the Eruv is canceling his domain to his neighbors, saying, you're welcome to come into my house with your stuff on Shabbat and leave. Eruv actually means, it comes from the word that they merge together, because they're merging their domains together. So theoretically, if you wanted to do an Eruv for the whole city, right, then everybody in the city, first of all, has to be walled, has to be gated, right? Certain Yeshuvim are completely gated, and then that's fine. And they also have to share or have a meal that everyone participates in. That's a main component of the Eruv. If you don't have that, you don't have an Eruv. All right. Having established the safeguard, however, the sages also introduced the Eruv. They did so in order to prevent their own protective degrees from becoming more burdensome than the Torah itself, while still allowing people a reasonable degree of freedom in their daily lives. Right? So this is, right, in general, what the Eruv is about. Not just Eruv on Shabbat, it's called Eruv Tchumin. There's Eruv Haserot. We have Eruv Tavshinin, which is what we did from Shavuot to Shabbat in order to cook, right? They all work on the same principle. The Eruv, therefore, operates entirely within the legal framework they established. It creates a distinction between the protected boundary itself and the enclosed area within, allowing movement within that space while preserving the integrity of the broader restriction. So within the Hatzer and the 4 neighbors sharing the Hatzer, they can move without restriction. However, that's only because they have an Eruv to say, oh, right, because we have an Eruv in our Hatzer, we can carry within our Hatzer. But that will prevent them from making the mistake that they would think they can carry also outside the Chatzir, right, in the public domain. So, Kuzzari says, I understand the principle. You understand? You all understand the principle? Was it clear?
Yes.
Okay, I see nods. Nevertheless, I still find it difficult to believe that an Eruv can genuinely unite separate areas into a single domain. He says, okay, so you found what? You make this magic trick, right? You take a piece of bread and a piece of meat, you mumble an abracadabra, a little biracha, and now, right, I pronounce you a single domain, private domain, right? How does this magic trick work? I don't get it. So that's it. You found some sort of formula. Says, well, if you reject this principle, then much of the Torah itself becomes difficult to explain. Do you accept the ownership of money, property, slaves, or even personal status can be transferred through specific legal acts, declarations, or documents? It says, you, king of Kuzzari, you're a king of a country, right? A person has a personal domain. What makes a person's property his property? It's all legal definition. What makes a person married? Right? Who says that a man and his wife, right, that his wife is his wife?
A contract.
A contract. What's a contract? By the way, according to the Torah, you don't even need to have the contract. The Hachamim made sure that when you get married, you have a ketubah. What makes something someone's possession? Said it's all comes down to some sort of legal act or declaration or document. And that's exactly what the Eruv is. Do you accept that a married woman becomes divorced through a written bill of divorce, or that an unmarried woman becomes legally married through a formal act of marriage? You're telling me that this piece of paper dictates the status of a person as either married or divorced? Right? If when I got divorced, right? When I got divorced, right? Made a ketubah. This piece of paper, now if we were in the United States, right? This piece of paper means, or even here, right? This piece of paper means that she's entitled to half of everything that I have. Yes, yeah, exactly. It's a piece of paper. It's a certified paper, certified by the court, right? That piece of paper makes you married or makes you divorced, right? How do you prove ownership of your house? It's a piece of paper. Also, everything comes down to some sort of legal act. So why is making an Eruv so difficult for you to understand? All these legal transformations depend upon prescribed procedures and formulas established by the Torah. Likewise, we're going back to our previous discussion. The status of a house or garment afflicted with leprosy depended upon a priest declaring it pure or impure. What is Tumah and Tahara? If you study the laws of Tumah and Tahara carefully, you see it all comes down to something being pronounced. For instance, let's say someone passes away in a room, and there are two different ways to exit the room, right? One through, let's say, the northern hallway, and one through the southern hallway. And a person's in the northern hallway, and they bring the corpse out through the southern hallway. Then, how do you call it? everything from that room through the southern hallway becomes impure from the moment the person died. If anything was in that space the moment the person died, then those things become impure. Let's say they brought him out through the southern hallway, as we said, but they intended to, when he died, they intended to take him out the northern hallway. However, change of plans, they took him out from the southern hallway. Then everything that was in the northern corridor at the time the person died becomes impure. And everything in the southern corridor at the time the person died now magically becomes pure again. It's not impure anymore. How does that work? So this means it has nothing to do. There's no actual physical essence of impurity or purity. It's all a legal prescription. The tabernacle becomes holy only when Moses erected it and anointed it with the sacred oil. Right? The building was there. Everything that made the Mishkan was there. When did it become sanctified? When Moses anointed it, when he consecrated it. That's when it became holy. Until then, until that moment, someone who was impure was allowed to be in the Kodesh Kodeshim, in the Holy of Holies, because it wasn't sanctified yet. The priests were consecrated to specific sacrifices and ceremonies, the Levites to their own rites of purification and dedication. Those who became impure were purified through the water of purification mixed with the ashes of the red heifer, hyssop and scarlet wool, Torah Shani and the Ezov. A house afflicted with ritual impurity was purified through a prescribed ceremony involving 2 birds. Right? Why does the para aduma make someone tahor after he was tameh? Because God said so. There's nothing in the ashes to remove your impurity. What makes you pure or impure? It's the word of the prescription of God. The mitzvah is what makes you pure or impure. This is where the alchemists and magicians went wrong. The alchemists imagined that if they could discover the correct combination of elements, they could reproduce nature's creative power and transform matter at will. However, purity and impurity, kedusha and tahara, have nothing to do with the state of the physical state of matter. It has to do with legal definition. The magicians made a similar mistake. Seeing that prophecy and divine revelation were associated with the sacrifices, they assumed that the prophets had discovered some hidden technique or formula. They imagined that miracles resulted from calculations, rituals, incense, astrological timings, or secret words. Abracadabra. What does abracadabra mean? It's in Hebrew, actually. Evra, I shall create ka'adabera, as I speak. Abracadabra. They therefore created elaborate systems of ceremonies, incantations, and astrological practices, hoping to reproduce prophetic experiences by their own ingenuity. They had startups on how to get divine influence. They saw the prophets perform certain sacrifices. They said, let's just copy his formula, and we too will receive prophecy without doing any of the intellectual work, any of the spiritual work. It's all meaningless. Religious commandments are like nature. To someone who does not understand their purpose, they may seem arbitrary and meaningless. All right. Let's skip right here. Imagine someone who knew nothing about reproduction. He would see the act of intimacy and regard it as strange, irrational, and degrading. Yet once he saw that it produces a new human being, he would recognize that what appeared trivial is actually one of the means by which God sustains the human race. So too with the commandments, right? We take the lulav, we take the etrog in the lulav, and we do this weird ritual going around, shaking it, right? It seems so arbitrary, so meaningless, but it doesn't matter. We don't do it to cause some sort of a spiritual alignment, right? There's no mechanics that it works. It's the word of God, and it's not the shaking of the lulav that brings the Shekhinah. It's the word of God that brings the Shekhinah, which in this specific case happens to be shake the lulav. But it could be anything, as long as it's what God told us to do. That's what brings us closer to God. From all this, it becomes clear that the path to God can only be known through God's own instruction. Because it's not what you do, it's the fact that God told you to do it. The commandments are not discovered through speculation, philosophy, or personal reasoning, but through prophecy, meaning God telling us this is what He wants us to do. And since prophecy is no longer available to us directly, our connection to those commandments depends upon faithful tradition. Right? Through prophecy, we received the tradition, and then the tradition was transmitted by edim kesherim v'ne'emanim, mipi edim kesherim v'ne'emanim. The people who transmitted these teachings were not a handful of isolated individuals. They were generations of learned, righteous, and spiritually elevated men, many of whom stood only a step below prophecy itself. Even if the Torah had been transmitted only through the priest Levites and the 70 elders, beginning with Moshe himself, the chain of transmission would still have remained unbroken. All right. Any questions before we close up for today?
Yes, I do have a question.
Yes,
Uh,
please.
On Shabbos, I found out where the Eruv is, where I live.
Yeah.
But that is and I walk inside sometimes with my siddur with toys. First, I want to know if this is okay.
Sorry.
I walk inside of the roof with the siddur and sometimes toys, or I always have something in my hands on Shabbos.
Look, if there's an Eruv, then it's mutar. The
Okay.
question is, what is the Eruv that they do? In my opinion, the Eruv almost everywhere is a joke.
Okay.
But follow for now. Just follow the mainstream. Follow. If everyone in your area practices according to the Eruv, rely on the Eruv for now. I probably wouldn't, but I'd say for now, just follow. Don't confuse yourself. Understand what the Eruv is. Good to know what it is. Follow whatever the custom is in your area.
Okay.
I can't, without actually seeing the Eruv anyways, I can't tell you if your Eruv is good or not. So I don't want to tell you it's not good if it may actually be good.
Isn't Bnei Brak, and my second question is there is a shul outside of the roof that I would like to go because they have Sesharet a bit later on
Yeah.
Shabbos, and can I take my siddur with me
Now,
outside of
if you
the?
know that there's no Eruv, you can go there, but you can't carry.
Okay.
Most shows have sidurim. Maybe you have specific sidur that you like, but you'll just have to rely on what they have over there.
Okay.
I never carry my sidur on Shabbat. Well, I don't even carry my talit. I just wear it.
Okay.
I'd
It's
say
because
maybe take
I
your siddur, wear it like a hat, but that's not it.
okay, like that.
No,
Okay.
don't do that.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Rabbi, shalom.
Yeah, shalom aleichem.
Shalom, shalom. Rabbi, my question is actually about tzedakah because I always get a little bit confused. It's 10% after I pay my bills. I mean, my bills in a way that it's the basic things. It's not like expensive things or something like that. Or I take the part after that.
I can't hear you
Or
very
after.
clearly. I'm assuming the question means you take 10% from the net or from the gross. I say it's not really that clear. If it's difficult for you, take it from
I'm sorry.
the net, not from the gross. Meaning after your expenses.
I see. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Anything else? Okay, so the main point, again, the Hachamim don't permit things that the Torah forbade. The purpose of the Hachamim is to make offense for the Torah. So when they come to permit something within Eruv or prosbul, we're not going to get into what that is. We don't have time for that. But it's something that the Torah permits. They forbid. It's usually has to do with the gray area. A gray area that can lead to confusion or lead to you thinking that if this is mutar, then maybe also carrying in the Reshut HaRabim is mutar. So they restricted the gray area, and they also prescribed something to permit you to carry within that gray area. All right? And this is part of the authority of the Chachamim because, right, they forbid it, they can also permit it. So as long as we rely, again, on the transmission, the tradition of the Chachamim, the words of the Chachamim, we can feel confident in our observance of the Torah that this is indeed what God wants from us. Remember, the question that the king of Kuzzari first approached Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi with, right? He says, I had a dream that said your intentions are warranted, but your actions aren't. So how do we know what are the actions that we want, that God wants from us? We rely on our tradition. And okay, that's it for today. Time. Next class is probably starting soon. So Erev Tov, everybody.